The crystal chandeliers of Willowmere Plantation's grand ballroom cast prismatic light across 300 guests, their laughter rising like steam from champagne flutes clutched in gloved hands. It was May 17, 1850, in Tidewater, Virginia, and the air hung thick with magnolia blossoms, roasted lamb, and the cloying sweetness of a five-tiered wedding cake that dominated the center table like a monument to prosperity. Richard Pemberton stood at the head of the receiving line in his dove-gray wedding suit, the fabric catching candlelight with an almost ethereal shimmer, each stitch so fine it seemed the work of angels rather than human hands. His bride, Catherine Ashford, now Catherine Pemberton, clung to his arm, her ivory silk gown cascading around her like sea foam, her face flushed with wine and overwhelming joy. The orchestra played a waltz. Servants in pristine white livery circulated with silver trays bearing oysters and delicate pastries dusted with sugar. Richard's father, Augustus Pemberton, a mountain of a man with steel-gray whiskers and eyes like chips of flint, held court near the fireplace, his voice booming across the ballroom as he proclaimed the Pemberton legacy secured for generations. No one noticed when Richard first touched his collar, a small gesture, barely perceptible, as though the fabric had suddenly become too tight. No one saw the slight grimace that crossed his features, gone so quickly it might have been a trick of flickering candlelight. Catherine noticed first. Her new husband's hand had gone rigid on her waist, his skin taking on a peculiar pallor beneath the warm glow of chandeliers, a grayish tint that made him look suddenly hollow. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening breeze. "Richard," she whispered, her smile faltering. "Are you quite well?" He tried to answer, but the words caught in his throat. His free hand pressed against his stomach, fingers digging into the buttoned vest as though trying to contain something terrible writhing beneath. The receiving line continued its flow, guests approaching with outstretched hands, oblivious to the small drama unfolding. Richard managed to nod, but Catherine could feel him trembling now, could see the muscle jumping in his jaw as he clenched his teeth against rising pain. The first convulsion struck Richard like a physical blow. His body went rigid, spine arching backward with such violence that Catherine stumbled away, her hand tearing free from his grip. A sound emerged from Richard's throat, not quite a scream, more animal than human, a guttural howl that sliced through the waltz music like a blade through silk. The orchestra faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward the groom as he collapsed onto the parquet floor, his pristine suit now crumpled and twisted, one hand clawing at his throat while the other beat against the polished wood in horrible, rhythmic drumming. Catherine's scream pierced the sudden silence. Augustus Pemberton bellowed his son's name, shoving through the crowd, his massive frame scattering guests like ninepins. "Richard! Richard, boy, what is it?" But Richard could not answer. His body convulsed again, back bowing until it seemed his spine might snap, legs kicking out and sending chairs toppling. Blood began to seep from his nose, twin crimson streams that painted his upper lip and dripped onto the snow-white cravat at his throat. His eyes had rolled back, showing only whites, and foam gathered at the corners of his mouth, foam tinged pink with blood from where he had bitten his tongue nearly in half. "Get Dr. Moss!" Augustus roared, dropping to his knees and gripping Richard's shoulders, trying futilely to still the convulsions. "Someone fetch Dr. Moss this instant." Dr. Harlan Moss pushed through the crowd, his medical bag already in hand, his weathered face tight with concentration. He knelt opposite Augustus, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he loosened Richard's cravat, checked his pulse, peeled back one eyelid to examine the dilated pupil beneath. What he saw there made his blood run cold. "Clear the room," Dr. Moss said quietly. "Augustus, we need to clear the room. Now." But Augustus was not listening. He cradled his son's head in his lap, heedless of the blood now flowing freely from Richard's nose and mouth, heedless of the vomit that suddenly erupted from the young man's throat in a violent, convulsive heave. The vomit was darker, streaked with blood that seemed almost black in the candlelight, and it carried a strange, bitter odor that made Dr. Moss's nostrils flare with recognition and dread. Catherine had collapsed onto a nearby chair, her wedding gown pooled around her like spilled milk, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed with the high, keening wail of a woman watching her entire future disintegrate. Richard's convulsions grew weaker now, the violent spasms giving way to smaller tremors. His breathing had become labored, each inhalation a wet, rattling sound that spoke of fluid filling his lungs. His skin had taken on an ashen quality, the gray deepening to something that looked almost like death itself, and his lips were turning black, as though darkness itself was spreading through his veins. "This cannot be," Dr. Moss muttered, his hands hovering uselessly over Richard's body. He recognized the symptoms, had read about them in medical journals, had heard whispered accounts from colleagues. But here? At a wedding celebration? "Augustus, I need to examine everything he's consumed." "Save him!" Augustus thundered. "Stop your damned questions and save my son." But Dr. Moss knew there was no saving Richard Pemberton. Whatever poison coursed through the young man's veins had already done its terrible work. The blackening of his extremities, for now his fingernails too had turned dark, spoke to a toxin so virulent that no antidote could hope to neutralize it in time. Richard's eyes opened one final time, the pupils so widely dilated that his irises had nearly disappeared. His lips moved, forming words that never emerged as sound, and then his body gave one last, shuddering convulsion before going completely still. The terrible rattling of his breath ceased. The tremors stopped. The light in those ruined eyes flickered and died like a candle consumed by its own flame. Dr. Moss placed 2 fingers against Richard's throat, feeling for a pulse he knew would not be there. After a long moment, he withdrew his hand and slowly shook his head. "He's gone. I'm sorry, Augustus. Richard is dead." Augustus Pemberton stared at his son's body as though his mind could not process what his eyes were seeing. Then he threw his head back and released a roar of grief and rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of Willowmere Plantation, a sound of such primal anguish that guests would speak of it in hushed tones for years afterward. He gathered Richard's lifeless body into his arms, rocking back and forth on the blood-stained floor, his expensive coat now ruined with gore. Pandemonium erupted. Women screamed. Men shouted. Servants scattered in all directions. The orchestra members abandoned their instruments and pushed toward the exits. Dr. Moss tried to restore order, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Through it all, unnoticed by any of the panicked guests, a figure stood motionless in the shadows of the kitchen doorway. Delphine watched with eyes as dark and still as winter ponds. She was 30 years old, though hardship had etched lines around her mouth and eyes that made her look older. She wore the plain homespun dress and head wrap of an enslaved seamstress, her fingers pricked and calloused from decades of pushing needles through recalcitrant fabric. She had crafted the dove-gray wedding suit with her own hands, had spent 3 months measuring and cutting and stitching. The suit that now served as Richard Pemberton's death shroud. Her face betrayed no emotion. No satisfaction. No remorse. No fear. She simply watched as Augustus Pemberton cradled his dead son and howled his grief. She watched as Dr. Moss knelt beside the body, his face creased with confusion. She watched as Catherine was carried away by her mother, the young widow's wedding day transformed into a nightmare. She watched as the ballroom emptied, as servants whispered and crossed themselves against evil. And when the last guest had departed, Delphine turned silently and walked through the kitchen, out the back door, across the swept dirt yard toward the row of small cabins that housed Willowmere's enslaved workers. She moved with unhurried grace, her footsteps making no sound. Behind her, the grand house blazed with light, every window illuminated as though trying to hold back the darkness that had invaded its halls. But Delphine walked into that darkness without hesitation, without looking back. In her cabin, a single room with a dirt floor, a narrow cot, and a small table that served as her sewing station, Delphine lit a single candle and sat down before her work basket. Inside lay spools of thread, needles, scissors. And tucked beneath a false bottom, 3 small glass jars filled with fine white powder that sparkled like sugar, like snow, like innocent dust. Delphine pulled one jar from its hiding place and held it up to the light. Arsenic. White arsenic, ground into powder so fine it could be mixed with beeswax to create a paste identical to the wax seamstresses used to coat their thread. When worked into fabric, when stitched into seams that would lie against bare skin, when woven into wool that would absorb a man's sweat, it became the perfect murder weapon. Richard Pemberton had worn his wedding suit for 6 hours. That was all it took. Delphine returned the jar to its hiding place and lay down on her cot, staring at the darkness above. From the main house, she could still hear Augustus Pemberton's anguished roars. Tomorrow the sheriff will come. Tomorrow questions will be asked. But they would not think to blame the seamstress. They would not think to examine the suit. They would not think to suspect that an enslaved woman could conceive of such calculated vengeance. They would not suspect her because they had never really seen her at all. Delphine closed her eyes and, for the first time in 3 years, allowed herself the ghost of a smile. One down. Augustus Pemberton had 2 more sons. The Ashfords would host a wedding next spring. The Fairchilds had just announced an engagement. Her reputation as the finest seamstress in Tidewater, Virginia was now secure, and wealthy families would soon send their sons to her with requests for wedding suits. They would come to her, one by one, and she would greet each commission with the same serene smile, the same promise of exquisite craftsmanship. And each garment would carry her signature, invisible, perfect, deadly. This was only the beginning. If you're enjoying this dark tale of revenge, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss another macabre story. Now, let's discover how this nightmare began. Delphine was born in the spring of 1820 in a cabin identical to the one she now occupied, delivered into bondage by her mother Iris during a thunderstorm so violent that the old women said it was an omen. Her first breath was drawn in a room that smelled of blood and rain-soaked earth, her first sight the rough wooden beams that would frame her entire existence. Iris, the head seamstress of Willowmere Plantation, held her newborn daughter close and whispered a prayer that the child might somehow escape the fate that bound them both to this land, to these masters, to lives measured out in thread and suffering. But prayers, Delphine would learn, were answered only in heaven, and heaven was a place that seemed very far from Tidewater, Virginia. Iris taught her daughter to sew before she could properly read. By age 5, Delphine could thread a needle and execute a basic running stitch. By 8, she could construct a simple shift dress without supervision. By 12, she was creating garments that rivaled her mother's work, buttonholes so precise they seemed mechanical, seams so straight they might have been drawn with a ruler, embroidery so delicate it looked like lace woven by spiders. Augustus Pemberton recognized the child's talent and declared that Delphine would follow her mother's profession. It was not a choice. It was never a choice. The sewing quarters occupied a corner of the plantation's main house, a small room with tall windows that caught the morning light. This was where Delphine spent her days, sitting beside her mother at the long worktable, their needles flashing in unison as they created beauty for people who owned them. They stitched mourning coats for Augustus and his sons. They constructed elaborate gowns for Augustus's wife, Margaret, who died of consumption when Delphine was 14. They made christening gowns for enslaver babies and burial shrouds for enslaved workers. Their fingers bled into the fabric, their eyesight dimmed from years of close work by candlelight, but still they sewed, because the alternative was the fields, and everyone knew the fields meant an early death. Delphine was 17 when she met Gabriel. He worked in the plantation's blacksmith shop, a tall man with hands scarred by forge work and eyes that held unexpected gentleness. They married in the way enslaved people married, without papers, without legal recognition, with only the blessing of their community and a stolen hour of celebration in the quarters after the day's labor ended. Augustus permitted the union because Gabriel was a valuable worker and Iris had requested it, and because enslaved people who formed families were less likely to run. The mathematics of bondage were always calculated in the master's favor. Their daughter Lily arrived 9 months later, a perfect child with her father's eyes and her mother's delicate fingers. Delphine would nurse her while sewing, the baby cradled in one arm while the other hand worked the needle. Iris doted on her granddaughter, fashioning tiny dresses from fabric scraps, singing old songs in a language she half remembered from her own grandmother. For 3 years, Delphine allowed herself to believe in something resembling happiness. She should have known better. Happiness was not meant for people like her. Augustus Pemberton's brother, Silas, arrived at Willowmere in the summer of 1840, fleeing debts and scandal in Richmond. He was a softer, weaker version of Augustus, same iron-gray eyes but without the steel behind them, same imposing frame but gone to fat from years of excess. He drank too much, gambled too much, and took what he wanted without regard for consequences. Within a week of his arrival, his eyes had found Delphine. She was working alone in the sewing quarters one August afternoon, Iris having taken Lily to the kitchen for a meal, when Silas entered without knocking. The door closing behind him had the finality of a coffin lid. Delphine stood from her work table, needle still in hand, and knew with terrible certainty what was about to happen. She had heard the whispered warnings from other women, had seen the way Silas looked at her during fittings, had felt his hand linger too long when she measured his inseam. "Please," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear flooding her veins. "Master Silas, please don't." He smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "You'll call for help, I suppose. You'll scream and bring the household running." He moved closer, backing her against the worktable. "And who do you think they'll believe? Who do you think they'll punish?" She did scream. She fought. Her needle scored a line across his cheek that would scar, and for that small act of resistance, he beat her until she could no longer stand. Then he took what he wanted while she lay broken on the floor among scattered spools of thread, her blood-staining fabric meant for a christening gown. When he finished, he stood, adjusted his clothes, and looked down at her with something like disgust. "Tell anyone," he said, "and I'll have that blacksmith husband of yours hanged for theft. Your choice." Gabriel knew. The moment he saw her face that evening, he knew. Delphine tried to hide the bruises, tried to invent a story about falling, but Gabriel was not fooled. His hands, so gentle with her, so brutal with iron, curled into fists. "I'll kill him," he whispered, and Delphine heard the truth in those words. Gabriel would kill Silas Pemberton, and then they would kill Gabriel, and probably Delphine too, and little Lily would be orphaned or sold away. The mathematics of bondage were always calculated in the master's favor. "No," Delphine said, gripping her husband's wrists. "No, Gabriel. We survive. That's all we can do. We survive." But Silas Pemberton was not finished extracting his price for Gabriel's continued existence. 2 months later, a silver candlestick went missing from the main house. Silas discovered it, how convenient, how perfectly timed, hidden beneath the straw mattress in Gabriel's cabin. Gabriel swore he had never seen it before, that it had been planted, but his protestations meant nothing. Augustus Pemberton prided himself on running an orderly plantation. Theft could not be tolerated. An example had to be made. They hanged Gabriel from the old oak tree near the tobacco barn on a Tuesday morning in October. All of Willowmere's enslaved workers were forced to watch, Augustus's version of education, a lesson written in rope and gravity. Delphine stood with Lily clutched in her arms, the child's face pressed against her mother's chest to spare her the sight, while Gabriel kicked and struggled at the rope's end until his body finally went still. The sound of his neck breaking was like a branch snapping in winter, sharp and final. Delphine did not cry. Could not cry. Something inside her had frozen solid, had transformed into ice so cold it could never melt. Silas Pemberton watched from the porch of the main house, one hand touching the scar on his cheek, a small smile playing at his lips. He had won. He had proven that he could take whatever he wanted, Delphine's body, Gabriel's life, and face no consequences. The mathematics of bondage were always calculated in the master's favor. Winter came, and with it a fever that swept through the quarters like wildfire. Lily fell ill in December, her small body burning with heat, her breathing shallow and labored. Delphine begged for the doctor, but Dr. Moss was attending to Augustus's prized hunting hounds, who had eaten something that disagreed with them. The hounds recovered. Lily did not. She died on Christmas Eve, 6 years old, calling for her father who would never answer. Delphine wrapped her daughter's body in a quilt pieced from fabric scraps, all the colors Lily had loved, and buried her in the small cemetery behind the quarters where enslaved children rested in unmarked graves. Iris followed 3 months later. The death of her granddaughter had broken something essential in the old woman. She simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped living. She died in her sleep one March night, and Delphine found her in the morning, peaceful at last, her scarred fingers still curved as though holding an invisible needle. Augustus gave permission for a burial but docked Delphine's already meager cloth ration to pay for the coffin wood. The mathematics of bondage were always calculated in the master's favor. Delphine became hollow after that. She worked her needle with mechanical precision, creating beauty for the family that had destroyed hers, speaking only when spoken to, existing rather than living. The other enslaved workers whispered that grief had taken her mind, that she had retreated to some interior place where pain could not reach. They were wrong. Delphine had not retreated. She had simply been waiting, watching, learning the patterns of the master's lives, storing away every slight, every cruelty, every casual exercise of power that ground human beings into property. And then one day, while cleaning the plantation's storage cellar, she found rat poison. It sat on a high shelf, covered in dust, in a small wooden box labeled in faded script, "White arsenic, for vermin." Delphine stared at that box for a long time, her heart beating faster than it had in years. She thought of Gabriel's body swinging from the oak tree. She thought of Lily's fevered face, her small hand reaching for help that never came. She thought of her mother dying from a broken heart, working to death for a family that viewed her as less than human. She thought of Silas Pemberton's smile. That night, she returned to the cellar and took the box. In her cabin, by candlelight, Delphine opened the box and examined its contents. The arsenic was coarse, granular, designed for mixing with grain to poison rats. But Delphine knew fabrics, knew textures, knew the feel of different materials between her fingers. She ground the arsenic finer using a smooth river stone against a piece of slate, working for hours until she had reduced it to powder as fine as flour. Then she mixed a small amount with beeswax and lanolin, working it into a paste that looked and felt exactly like the wax she used to coat her thread before stitching. She tested it first on a scrap of wool, coating the thread and working it through the fabric, then setting it aside to see if it would show, if it would discolor, if anyone would notice. The fabric remained pristine. The poison was invisible. Delphine stared at that scrap of wool and understood, with perfect clarity, that she had found her weapon. Not a knife that could be taken from her hands. Not poison that could be traced to a cup or plate. But thread and fabric and the very garments these people wore against their skin, the suits that marked their status and prosperity, transformed into instruments of slow, invisible death. The mathematics of bondage had always been calculated in the master's favor. But Delphine had just learned a new kind of arithmetic, one measured in stitches and seams, in wedding suits and poison thread, in patience and revenge. She smiled for the first time since Gabriel died, a terrible smile that held no warmth, no joy, only the cold satisfaction of a plan beginning to form. They had taken everything from her. Now she would take everything from them, one stitch at a time. Clayton Hodge was not a Pemberton by blood, but he might as well have been. As overseer of Willowmere's eastern fields, he wielded his authority with the same casual cruelty as any master, his whip singing through the humid Virginia air with a sound that haunted workers' dreams. He was a thick-necked man with sunburned skin and small, mean eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. In the 2 years since Augustus had hired him, 3 workers had died under his supervision, 1 from infected lash wounds, 2 from heatstroke after Hodge refused them water during punishment. The quarters whispered his name like a curse. In March of 1847, 6 months after Delphine had discovered the arsenic, Clayton Hodge's wife Martha came to the sewing quarters with a request. She was a mousy woman with apologetic eyes who seemed perpetually embarrassed by her husband's brutality but never spoke against it. "Delphine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need a new Sunday coat made for Clayton." His old one has worn through at the elbows, and he's particular about his appearance for church. Delphine looked up from her work, her face as smooth and unreadable as always. Yes, Miss Martha. When would you be needing it? A month? Is that sufficient time? Martha produced a bolt of heavy brown wool, good quality fabric that must have cost Clayton a week's wages. He wants it well made. Says if you do fine enough work for the Pembertons, you can certainly manage a proper coat for him. Yes, Miss Martha, Delphine repeated, taking the fabric into her hands. The wool was coarse, tightly woven, perfect for absorbing and holding moisture against the skin. Perfect for her purposes. I'll have it ready within the month. That night, alone in her cabin, Delphine laid the wool across her work table and studied it by candlelight. This would be her first attempt, her first test of whether theory could become practice, whether the weapon she had conceived would actually work. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her supplies, the arsenic powder she had ground to impossible fineness, the beeswax and lanolin she had carefully measured and mixed. She worked methodically, coating her thread with the poisoned wax, testing the flexibility, ensuring it would pass through fabric as smoothly as ordinary thread. The construction of Clayton Hodges' Sunday coat took 3 weeks. Delphine worked on it during the day in the sewing quarters, creating a garment that would pass any inspection, its construction flawless, its seams straight and strong. But at night, in her cabin, she reworked those seams with her special thread, concentrating the poison in the areas that would rest closest to skin, the collar, the interior of the cuffs, the lining along the shoulders and back. She rubbed additional arsenic directly into the wool fibers of the lining, grinding it in with patient, circular motions until it became part of the fabric itself. The powder was invisible against the brown wool, and the coating on the thread left no residue, no discoloration, nothing that would alert even the most careful observer. When she delivered the finished coat to Martha Hodge, the woman examined it with obvious pleasure. "Oh, Delphine, it's beautiful. Clayton will be so pleased. The stitching is exquisite." "Thank you, Miss Martha," Delphine said, her voice empty of pride or satisfaction. She watched Martha carry the coat away, its weight heavy with more than just wool and thread, and returned to her cabin to wait. Clayton Hodge wore his new Sunday coat to church the following week. And the week after that. And the week after that. Delphine watched him from a distance as he strutted about the plantation in his fine new garment, his chest puffed with pride, his hand occasionally smoothing down the lapels. She watched and waited, her patience absolute, her faith in the poison unwavering. The symptoms began in the 4th week. Hodge complained of stomach pains, and blamed the cook for serving spoiled meat. In the 5th week, he developed a persistent cough and a burning sensation in his throat that he attributed to the spring pollen. By the 6th week, his skin had taken on a grayish cast, and his hands trembled when he raised his whip. The workers in the eastern fields noticed the change, whispered about it in the quarters, and wondered if perhaps God had finally decided to answer their prayers. Dr. Moss was summoned in the 7th week when Hodge collapsed in the fields, vomiting and convulsing. The doctor examined him thoroughly, noted the deterioration of his health, the weakness in his limbs, the confusion that came and went like fog. "It presents like cholera," Dr. Moss told Augustus Pemberton, who had come to check on his overseer's condition. "Though the progression is unusual." "Has he traveled recently? Been exposed to contaminated water?" "He's been nowhere but Willowmere," Augustus said, his face grave. "Can you save him?" Dr. Moss prescribed laudanum for the pain, bed rest, bland foods. But Hodge continued to deteriorate. His hair began falling out in clumps. His fingernails turned dark and brittle. The burning sensation spread from his throat to his entire chest, as though fire consumed him from within. He screamed at night, keeping Martha awake with his agony, crying out that his skin was burning, that something was eating him alive from the inside. He died on a Sunday morning in June, 8 weeks after he first wore the coat. Dr. Moss signed the death certificate listing cause of death as cholera complicated by organ failure. Martha Hodge became a widow at 26, inheriting nothing but debts and a house that smelled of sickness and death. She packed Clayton's belongings into a trunk, including the beautiful brown Sunday coat that he had worn so proudly, and moved back to her father's farm in Petersburg. The coat went with her, folded carefully, its secrets sealed in wool and thread. Delphine attended the funeral because all plantation workers were required to show respect for white overseers. She stood at the back of the small cemetery, her face appropriately solemn, and watched Clayton Hodges' coffin lowered into the ground. She felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, no fear. Only a cold certainty that her method worked, that her weapon was perfected, that she could kill with invisible patience and absolute precision. If this story is sending chills down your spine, leave a comment below telling me which historical horror story I should cover next. Your suggestions fuel this channel. That night, alone in her cabin, Delphine made careful notes in a small ledger she kept hidden beneath her mattress. She recorded the amount of arsenic used, the placement of the poison seams, the timeline from first wearing to death. She noted what had worked, the concentration in the collar and cuffs, the powder worked into the lining, and what she might improve. The burning sensation had made Hodge suspicious toward the end, made him pull at his collar and complain about the fabric. Next time, she would use less concentrated doses, spread the poison more evenly throughout the garment, extend the timeline from weeks to months if necessary. Patience was her greatest advantage. She had all the time in the world. Augustus Pemberton hired a new overseer, a man named Vincent Crawford who proved marginally less cruel than his predecessor. Life at Willowmere continued its inexorable rhythm, planting and harvest, birth and death, the grinding machinery of bondage turning season after season. And in her small corner of the main house, Delphine sewed, her needles flashing in the morning light, creating beauty with one hand while death waited in her other. Her reputation as a seamstress continued to grow. Word of her exceptional work spread beyond Willowmere, carried by visiting plantation wives who admired the garments she created. The Ashfords of Maplecrest Plantation, 12 miles to the north, requested her services for their daughter's trousseau. The Fairchilds of Oakhaven, across the James River, commissioned a set of dress shirts for their eldest son. Delphine accepted each request with quiet grace, her face betraying nothing of the calculations running beneath her calm exterior. She had learned the most important lesson: no one would ever suspect her. She was property, invisible, a tool no different from a loom or a spinning wheel. They saw her hands, her needlework, her utility, but never her mind, never her rage, never the cold mathematics of revenge that she worked out stitch by patient stitch. They brought her their finest fabrics and their most important commissions, never imagining that those skilled hands could transform celebration into mourning, that those careful stitches could spell death. The quarters whispered sometimes about Clayton Hodges' death, about how God had struck him down for his cruelty. But no one connected his death to the seamstress who had made his coat. Why would they? Delphine was just Delphine, quiet, obedient, skilled with a needle. Tragic, certainly, having lost her entire family, but harmless. Always harmless. She smiled her empty smile and continued her work, each garment a masterpiece, each commission accepted with appropriate humility. And deep in her cabin, hidden beneath the false bottom of her sewing basket, the jars of white powder waited like patient promises. She had 3 jars now, having traded sewing services to the cook for access to the storage cellar, and she guarded them more carefully than any treasure. This was her inheritance, her power, her justice. This was how she would balance the scales that had been weighted against her since birth. The mathematics of bondage had always been calculated in the master's favor. But Delphine had learned to count in ways they could never imagine, in stitches per inch, in poison per seam, in deaths per dozen garments. She had become something new, something terrible and patient and absolutely focused. She had become an instrument of vengeance so refined, so invisible, that it could move among them like a ghost, touching their lives with lethal precision while they remained blissfully, fatally unaware. And soon, very soon, there would be another wedding at Willowmere. Augustus Pemberton's eldest son Richard had announced his engagement to Catherine Ashford. The date was set for May of 1850. There would be 3 months to prepare, to create a wedding suit worthy of the Pemberton name, to craft a garment so beautiful that it would be remembered for generations. Delphine had already begun planning the measurements, the cut, the placement of every poison seam. This would be her masterpiece. This would be the moment her private war became public, though no one would recognize it as such. Richard Pemberton would die in glory, dressed in perfection, and she would watch it happen with the same calm face she had worn since the day they hanged Gabriel from the oak tree. The apprenticeship was over. The real work was about to begin. The death of Richard Pemberton in May 1850 should have been an isolated tragedy, a mysterious illness that struck down a young man in his prime and left his family devastated but unaware. Dr. Harlan Moss filed his report citing sudden apoplexy, perhaps triggered by an undetected weakness of the heart. The funeral drew mourners from across Tidewater, Virginia, and Richard was buried in the family plot beneath a marble angel that wept stone tears into eternity. Augustus Pemberton aged 10 years in the weeks following his son's death, his iron-gray hair turning white at the temples, his booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. Catherine Pemberton, widow before she was truly a wife, returned to her father's house in black mourning dress that Delphine had sewn with particular care, ensuring that the fabric contained nothing but grief. But Delphine's work was far from finished. Augustus had 2 more sons. James Pemberton was 22, a quieter version of his dead brother, more interested in books and horses than the brutal management of plantation business. He had been courting Eleanor Whitmore of Riverside Plantation for over a year, and their engagement had been announced shortly before Richard's death. In the wake of tragedy, some suggested postponing the wedding, but Augustus would not hear of it. "Life continues," he said, his jaw set with grim determination. "The Pemberton line will not end with Richard's death. James will marry, will give me grandchildren, will carry forward everything I have built." The wedding was scheduled for September 1851, 16 months after Richard's death, a period of mourning that satisfied propriety while allowing Augustus to cling to hope for the future. And once again, the finest seamstress in Virginia was summoned to create the groom's attire. Delphine received the commission in July. Augustus himself came to the sewing quarters, his face haggard, his eyes haunted by loss. "I want something extraordinary for James," he said. "Midnight blue wool, silver embroidery at the cuffs and collar. Make it finer than anything you created for Richard. Make it worthy of a Pemberton." "Yes, Master Augustus," Delphine said, her voice carrying the proper note of respectful submission. "I will create something he'll never forget." She worked on James Pemberton's wedding suit through the heat of August and into September, her fingers moving with mechanical precision through the intricate embroidery, the careful construction of lapels and vents and pockets. In the daylight hours, she created beauty. In the darkness of her cabin, she created death. The midnight blue wool was even better suited to her purposes than Richard's dove gray had been, darker fabric concealed the arsenic powder more effectively, and the heavy embroidery thread she used for the silver decorations carried 3 times the poison of ordinary thread. She concentrated the toxin not just in the collar and lining but worked it into the very fabric of the vest, which would press directly against James's chest for hours at a time. James Pemberton married Eleanor Whitmore on September 14, 1851, beneath the same oak trees where his brother had celebrated 16 months earlier. The ceremony was smaller, more subdued, shadowed by remembered grief. But James looked magnificent in his midnight blue suit, the silver embroidery catching the autumn sunlight like captured stars. Eleanor wept with joy. Augustus smiled for the first time since Richard's death. Dr. Moss, attending as a guest, complimented Delphine on the extraordinary craftsmanship of the suit. She accepted the praise with downcast eyes and returned to her quarters. This time, Delphine had refined her method. Rather than concentrating the poison for quick death, she had spread it more evenly, reducing the dosage in any single location. James would wear his wedding suit for the ceremony, then again for church services, social calls, formal dinners. The poison would accumulate slowly, building in his system over weeks and months rather than hours and days. The death would appear more natural, less suspicious, a wasting disease rather than sudden catastrophe. James began to sicken in October. First came the fatigue, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. Then the stomach troubles, cramping, nausea, a persistent loss of appetite. By November, his hands trembled when he tried to write, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that Eleanor attributed to the declining autumn light. Dr. Moss prescribed tonics and bed rest, suggesting that perhaps James was suffering delayed grief over his brother's death, that melancholy could manifest as physical illness. In December, James developed a burning sensation in his chest that he described as feeling like hot coals pressed against his ribs. He stopped wearing his wedding suit, claimed the wool irritated his skin, but the damage was already done. The arsenic had permeated his system, concentrating in his organs, destroying him from within. By January 1852, he could no longer leave his bed. By February, he no longer recognized his wife. He died on February 28, 7 months after his wedding, while Delphine sewed a christening gown in the main house and listened to Eleanor's sobs echoing down the hallway. Dr. Moss listed consumption as the cause of death, noting the wasting, the chest pains, the deterioration that mimicked tuberculosis. Augustus Pemberton buried his second son beside his first, beneath another weeping angel, and something inside the old man broke that could never be repaired. He stopped visiting the eastern fields, stopped hosting dinners, stopped speaking of the future. His remaining son, 12-year-old William, became the sole repository of his hopes, a burden too heavy for a child's shoulders. But Delphine's reputation as a seamstress had spread beyond Tidewater, Virginia. Wealthy families from Richmond, from Petersburg, from as far as North Carolina, heard tales of the enslaved woman whose needlework rivaled the finest tailors in Europe. They came to Willowmere requesting her services, and Augustus, needing the income, needing the distraction, agreed to hire her out. She traveled to other plantations with a white overseer as escort, her sewing supplies carefully packed, her jars of arsenic hidden in false-bottomed baskets that no one thought to examine. In June 1852, Delphine was commissioned to create a wedding suit for Nathaniel Ashford of Maplecrest Plantation, Catherine Pemberton's younger brother. The family knew tragedy. Catherine was still in mourning for Richard, but life demanded continuation, and Nathaniel's engagement to a Charleston heiress promised financial alliance and social advancement. Delphine crafted a suit of charcoal wool with black velvet trim, working her poison into every seam with the patience of a spider spinning her web. Nathaniel wore it for his wedding in August. He died on his honeymoon in October, his young bride returning home alone, bewildered by the rapid decline of her husband's health. The doctors in Charleston blamed tropical fever, though Nathaniel had never left Virginia. In March 1853, Thomas Fairchild of Oakhaven Plantation commissioned a wedding suit of forest green wool. He married in April, a grand affair with 300 guests and a reception that lasted until dawn. Delphine attended as part of the enslaved workforce hired to serve, watching from the kitchen as Thomas danced with his bride, as he laughed and drank champagne and looked every inch the prosperous young master in his perfectly tailored suit. He died in May, barely a month married, his death attributed to a riding accident complicated by infection, though Thomas's father privately told Augustus Pemberton that his son had been too weak to ride for weeks before the fall, had been wasting away from some mysterious illness. In November 1854, Edmund Whitmore of Riverside Plantation, Eleanor's brother, James Pemberton's brother-in-law, requested a wedding suit of burgundy wool for his January nuptials. Delphine created a masterpiece, each stitch perfect, each seam deadly. Edmund's death was the most agonizing yet, lasting 3 months, his body convulsing with pains that morphed from his stomach to his chest to his limbs, his skin erupting in lesions that the doctors could not explain, his mind deteriorating until he screamed about demons in his clothing, devils in his skin. He tore at his wedding suit during his final weeks, ripping the fabric, pulling at seams, as though some animal instinct warned him of the source of his torment. But by then it was too late. He died in April 1855, and his widow burned the burgundy suit in the fireplace, claiming it was cursed. By the spring of 1855, whispers had begun to circulate among Virginia's plantation aristocracy. 6 young men, all recently married, all wealthy, all wearing suits created by the same enslaved seamstress, had died under mysterious circumstances within 5 years. The deaths had seemed isolated at first, tragedies separated by time and distance. But families talked at social gatherings, compared notes over dinner, and gradually a pattern emerged that was too consistent to be mere coincidence. Augustus Pemberton heard the whispers. In his grief-darkened study at Willowmere, he received visits from other fathers who had lost sons, other families touched by inexplicable tragedy. They spread maps across his desk, marking plantations, noting dates, counting deaths. 6 weddings. 6 suits. 6 deaths within months of marriage. And at the center of every tragedy, like a spider at the center of her web, sat one name, Delphine. It cannot be, Augustus said, but his voice lacked conviction. She's been with my family for 30 years. She's just a seamstress. He could not finish the sentence. Just a slave, he meant to say. Just property. Just a tool incapable of such calculation, such patience, such cold and perfect vengeance. But doubt, once planted, grew like poisonous flowers in his mind. He thought of Richard's blackened lips, of James's wasting death, of the other families who had trusted Delphine's needle and buried their sons. He thought of how she had never changed expression, never showed emotion, how she had moved through Willowmere like a ghost for years, silent and obedient and utterly invisible. He thought of Gabriel hanged from the oak tree, of little Lily dead from neglected fever, of Iris's heartbreak. He thought of Silas and what his brother had done, what they had all allowed to happen. The mathematics suddenly seemed very different when calculated from this angle. Augustus summoned Sheriff Benjamin Thorne to Willowmere and shared his terrible suspicions. The sheriff, a practical man who had spent 30 years enforcing order in Tidewater, Virginia, listened with growing horror. "You understand what you're suggesting," Thorne said quietly. "If this is true, if an enslaved woman has been murdering the sons of Virginia's finest families for 5 years, then she must be stopped," Augustus finished, his voice hollow. "Search her quarters. Examine her supplies. Find the evidence we need." That night, while Delphine sat calmly in the sewing quarters finishing a child's dress, Sheriff Thorne and 4 deputies descended on her cabin with lanterns and grim determination. They tore apart her narrow cot, appended her worktable, emptied her sewing basket onto the dirt floor. And there, beneath the false bottom she had so carefully constructed, they found what Augustus had feared, 3 glass jars of white powder, meticulously labeled in tiny script, Richard, May 1850, James, September 1851, others. They found a ledger documenting doses and timelines, written in code but clear enough in its terrible precision. And wrapped in a piece of black silk, they found 6 locks of hair, each tied with black ribbon, each labeled with a name and date. Trophies. Memories. Proof. Delphine did not resist when they arrested her. She stood calmly as Sheriff Thorne read the charges, as deputies bound her wrists, as Augustus Pemberton stared at her with horror and grudging comprehension finally dawning in his eyes. She met his gaze without flinching, without fear, and smiled a smile that held no warmth, only cold satisfaction. "You took my family," she said, her voice clear and steady after years of silence. "I took yours. We are even now." They locked Delphine in the old tobacco barn at the edge of Willowmere's property, a structure that had fallen into disuse after Augustus converted the plantation's focus to cotton and wheat. The barn still smelled of dried leaf and earth, its walls thick with shadows that the single lantern could not dispel. They chained her wrists to an iron ring set into a support beam, gave her a blanket and a bucket, and posted 2 guards at the door. Sheriff Benjamin Thorne wanted her contained while he conducted his investigation, wanted to ensure she could not destroy evidence or harm herself before facing whatever justice Virginia law would impose upon an enslaved woman who had murdered 6 white men. Word of the arrest spread through Tidewater, Virginia like wildfire through dry grass. Plantation owners arrived at Willowmere in coaches and on horseback, demanding answers, seeking confirmation that the seamstress who had worked in their homes, who had touched their clothing and their children's garments, was truly the architect of so much grief. The Ashford family came from Maplecrest, still mourning Nathaniel. The Fairchilds arrived from Oakhaven, Thomas's father white-faced with rage and horror. The Whitmores rode from Riverside, Eleanor Pemberton among them, her widow's weeds replaced by a dress of deep purple, her face a mask of barely contained fury. In the main house, Sheriff Thorne laid out the evidence on Augustus's dining table like pieces of a macabre puzzle. The 3 jars of arsenic powder, their contents analyzed by Dr. Harlan Moss, who confirmed with absolute certainty that the substance was white arsenic of exceptional purity. The ledger with its coded entries that a clerk from Petersburg had partially deciphered, dates, measurements, notations about dosage and placement that read like a systematic manual for murder. The 6 locks of hair, each tied with black ribbon and labeled in Delphine's precise hand, Richard Pemberton, James Pemberton, Nathaniel Ashford, Thomas Fairchild, Edmund Whitmore, Clayton Hodge. Hodge? Augustus said, his voice rough. The overseer who died of cholera in 47? Her first victim, we believe, Sheriff Thorne replied. A test case. She made him a Sunday coat, and he died 8 weeks after first wearing it. The symptoms matched the others, the stomach pains, the burning sensation, the wasting. But no one suspected murder because he was just an overseer, and cholera was plausible. Dr. Moss stood at the window, staring out at the spring landscape without seeing it. I should have recognized the pattern, he said quietly. The symptoms were consistent across all 6 cases, but I attributed them to different causes. Apoplexy for Richard. Consumption for James. Tropical fever for Nathaniel. I failed these families. I failed these young men. You could not have known, Augustus said, though his tone carried no comfort. None of us could have imagined that a slave, he stopped, the word catching in his throat. For 30 years, Delphine had been property to him, a valuable asset but nothing more. Now he was forced to confront the reality that she had possessed the intelligence, the patience, and the will to orchestrate a campaign of revenge so calculated that it had taken 5 years and 6 deaths before anyone suspected murder. Sheriff Thorne had also brought the wedding suits, or what remained of them. Richard's dove-gray suit had been buried with him, but James's midnight blue suit with silver embroidery had been preserved by Eleanor. Nathaniel's charcoal suit had been stored by his widow. Edmund's burgundy suit had been burned, but the ashes were saved. Sheriff Thorne had these garments examined by a chemist from Richmond, a man named Professor Howard Sterling who specialized in toxicology. Professor Sterling's report was damning in its precision. The thread used in the interior seams shows traces of arsenic mixed with beeswax and lanolin, he explained to the assembled plantation owners who had gathered in Augustus's study. The poison was applied to the thread itself, then worked through fabric that would rest against the skin. Additionally, arsenic powder was rubbed directly into the wool fibers of the lining. Each time the victim wore the garment, his body heat and perspiration would activate the poison, allowing it to absorb through the skin. Over time, the accumulation would reach lethal levels. How much time? Thomas Fairchild's father asked, his hands trembling. That depended on the concentration and the frequency of wearing, Sterling replied. In the case of Richard Pemberton, who wore his suit continuously during his wedding celebration, the dose was concentrated enough to kill within hours. For others, like James Pemberton, the poison was more diluted but spread more thoroughly throughout the garment. Death would come more slowly but just as inevitably. It is, I must say, a remarkably sophisticated method of murder. The perpetrator possessed considerable knowledge of chemistry, textiles, and human physiology. The room fell silent. The notion that an enslaved woman, denied education, denied autonomy, denied even recognition as fully human by the laws that governed them, could possess such knowledge, could execute such a complex plot, challenged every assumption these men held about the natural order of their world. Augustus broke the silence. I want to speak with her. Sheriff Thorne nodded. I expected you would. But I must warn you, Augustus, she shows no remorse. No fear. Whatever humanity you remember in her is gone. They walked across the plantation grounds as the sun set over the fields, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Guards opened the tobacco barn door, and Augustus stepped inside, Sheriff Thorne remaining just outside the entrance. Delphine sat against the far wall, her wrists still chained, her face turned toward the sliver of dying light that penetrated the gaps in the barn walls. She did not acknowledge Augustus's presence until he spoke. "Why?" The single word emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Delphine, in God's name, why?" She turned her head slowly, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. For a long moment, she said nothing, studying the man who had owned her since birth, who had taken her mother's labor and her daughter's life and her husband's breath with the same casual exercise of power he used to direct the planting of wheat. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Do you remember Gabriel?" she asked. Augustus frowned. "Your husband. The blacksmith. He was hanged for theft." "He stole nothing," Delphine said. "Your brother Silas planted that candlestick in our cabin because Gabriel wanted to kill him for what Silas did to me. So Silas killed Gabriel first, made it look like justice, and you let it happen because one blacksmith was easily replaced." Augustus's face paled. I did not know about Silas, Anne." "You did not care to know," Delphine interrupted, her voice cutting like a blade. "Do you remember my daughter? Lily? She was 6 years old when she died of fever because her hunting hounds needed Dr. Moss more than a slave child did. Do you remember my mother, Iris, who served your family for 40 years and died of a broken heart after watching her granddaughter buried in an unmarked grave?" "Those were tragedies," Augustus said weakly. Not murder. We're approaching the terrifying conclusion, but before we get there, if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button. These dark histories deserve to be remembered." "No." Delphine's smile was terrible in its emptiness. "What do you call it when you work a woman to death? When you let a child die for lack of medicine? When you hang an innocent man to satisfy your brother's cruelty? You call it property management. You call it the natural order. You call it anything but murder because we are not human to you, not really. We are tools that walk and talk and bleed, but our deaths do not count the same as yours." "So you killed my sons," Augustus said, his voice breaking. "You killed Richard and James. You destroyed my family." "I took from you what you took from me," Delphine replied. "One family for another. One husband for 2 sons. One daughter for 6 deaths. The mathematics never balanced, Master Augustus. I lost more than you could ever lose, and I did it with less power than you could ever imagine. But I found a way. I found the one thing I could control, the one weapon that made me more than property. My needle. My thread. My patience." Augustus stared at her, and in that moment, he saw what Sheriff Thorne had warned him about. There was no remorse in those eyes, no regret, only cold satisfaction in something that might have been pride. She had transformed herself from victim to executioner, had weaponized the very skills that made her valuable to her enslavers, had turned beauty into death and stitched vengeance into every seam. "They will hang you," Augustus said finally. "You know that. Virginia law allows no other punishment for a slave who murders a white man, let alone 6. "I know," Delphine said calmly. "I have always known how this would end. But it was worth it. Every stitch was worth it. To see your face when Richard died. To watch James waste away. To know that for once, for just a brief moment, I had the power and you had none. That was worth my life." Augustus turned toward the door, then stopped. "Was there ever anything else planned? Any other commissions you have not yet delivered?" Delphine's smile widened, and Augustus felt his blood turn to ice. "You should ask what I was working on before Sheriff Thorne arrested me," she said softly. "You should ask who commissioned a wedding suit just 2 months ago. You should ask about measurements I took, fabric I selected, seams I planned." Augustus's mouth went dry. His mind raced through recent weeks, recent conversations. And then he remembered, his own announcement, made in late February, that he intended to remarry. His engagement to Margaret Whitfield, a wealthy widow from Charleston, had been formalized in March. The wedding was planned for June. And he had commissioned a wedding suit, had visited Delphine in the sewing quarters personally to discuss the details, had requested something magnificent to mark his return to life after years of mourning. "No," he whispered. "No, you could not have. It hangs in your wardrobe," Delphine said, her voice light, almost musical. "Charcoal gray wool with black silk lining. I finished it last week, delivered it to your room by myself. I believe your man Willis brushed it just yesterday to prepare for your final fitting. Beautiful work, if I may say so. Perhaps my finest creation. Every seam is perfect. Every stitch is deadly." Augustus ran from the tobacco barn, his boots pounding across the dirt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sheriff Thorne called after him, but Augustus did not stop until he reached the main house, did not pause until he had climbed the stairs to his bedroom chamber. His wardrobe stood open. Willis must have been preparing his evening clothes, and there, hanging with careful precision, was the suit Delphine had created for his wedding. He reached for it with trembling hands, then jerked back as though the fabric might bite. The suit was magnificent, exactly as she had described, the charcoal wool perfectly tailored, the black silk lining gleaming like oil in the lamplight. He had worn it once, just 2 days ago, for a fitting that had lasted perhaps 20 minutes. His skin had felt slightly irritated afterward, a minor burning sensation he had attributed to the newness of the wool. Augustus backed away from the wardrobe, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sheriff Thorne appeared in the doorway, Dr. Moss behind him, both men breathless from running. Augustus pointed at the suit with a shaking hand, unable to form words. Professor Sterling was summoned from the guest quarters where he had been staying. The chemist examined the suit carefully, scraping samples from the lining, testing the thread, his expression growing grimmer with each passing moment. "It contains arsenic," Sterling confirmed. "Considerable amounts worked throughout the garment. If you had worn this for your wedding, Mr. Pemberton, you would have died within weeks. Perhaps within days, given the concentration." She meant this to be her masterpiece. Augustus sank onto his bed, his face ashen. He had escaped death by pure chance, by the accident of timing that had led Sheriff Thorne to search Delphine's quarters before the wedding rather than after. But the proximity of his own extinction, the knowledge that he had hung his death in his wardrobe, had admired its construction, had praised the seamstress for her exceptional work, broke something inside him that grief alone had not managed to destroy. In the tobacco barn, Delphine sat in her chains and smiled at the shadows gathering around her. The suit was delivered. The trap was set. And whether Augustus Pemberton died by her hand or died knowing he had come within inches of that fate, she had won. The mathematics were finally balanced. The scales of justice, her justice, the only justice she would ever know, had been set right. Tomorrow they will take her to trial. Tomorrow they will condemn her. Tomorrow they would build the scaffold and prepare the rope. But tonight, in the darkness of the tobacco barn, Delphine closed her eyes and saw Gabriel's face, heard Lily's laughter, felt her mother's hands guiding her first stitches. Tonight, she was at peace. The trial of Delphine lasted less than 3 hours. Virginia law in 1855 did not permit enslaved people to testify in their own defense, to call witnesses on their behalf, or to be judged by a jury of their peers, for they had no peers under the law, only owners. The proceedings took place not in a proper courthouse but in the meeting hall of Willowmere Plantation, with Augustus Pemberton present as both victim and judge, his authority as master superseding any pretense of impartial justice. Sheriff Benjamin Thorne presented the evidence, the jars of arsenic, the coded ledger, the locks of hair, Professor Howard Sterling's chemical analysis of the wedding suits. The assembled plantation owners, the Ashfords, the Fairchilds, the Whitmores, bore witness to the catalogue of horrors, each family's tragedy laid bare like anatomical specimens under scrutiny. Delphine stood in chains throughout the proceedings, her face as calm and unreadable as it had been for the past 8 years, since the day Gabriel's body went still beneath the hanging tree. She was not permitted to speak, but her silence held more weight than any testimony could have carried. When Sheriff Thorne displayed the 6 locks of hair, she met the eyes of the bereaved fathers and widows without shame or apology. When Professor Sterling explained her method, the grinding of arsenic to powder, the mixing with thread wax, the patient application to seams and linings, she nodded slightly, as though acknowledging the accuracy of his assessment. When Augustus Pemberton stood and described finding the poisoned wedding suit hanging in his wardrobe, death waiting in charcoal wool and black silk, she smiled that terrible, empty smile that haunted the nightmares of everyone present. The verdict was predetermined. Guilty of murder by poison. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of destruction of property, for under Virginia law, the deaths of enslaved people's families counted only as economic loss to their owners. The sentence was equally inevitable. Death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence on the grounds of Willowmere Plantation, with all enslaved workers required to attend as witness and warning. Augustus Pemberton signed the execution order with a hand that still trembled when he thought of wearing that beautiful suit, of standing at the altar beside Margaret Whitfield while poison seeped into his skin, while his death unfolded seam by invisible seam. They returned Delphine to the tobacco barn, but this time without chains. What point was there in restraining a woman already condemned, a woman who had spent 5 years patiently engineering her revenge and showed no inclination to flee now that her work was complete? The guards remained posted at the door, but inside the barn, Delphine sat on a rough wooden bench and allowed herself the luxury of memory. She thought of her mother Iris teaching her first stitches by candlelight, the needle flashing like a silver fish in the darkness. She thought of Gabriel's hands, scarred by forge work but so gentle when they touched her face. She thought of Lily's laughter, bright as bells, silenced too soon by fever and neglect. She thought of the moment she had discovered the arsenic, and had understood that her needle could be more than a tool of creation, it could be an instrument of justice, cold and patient and absolutely precise. The plantation had fallen into an uneasy quiet following the trial. Work continued because it always continued, the machinery of bondage grinding forward regardless of scandal or death, but conversations were hushed and faces were drawn with a mixture of horror and something that might have been reluctant admiration. In the quarters, enslaved workers whispered Delphine's name with a reverence usually reserved for Moses or Harriet Tubman, seeing in her actions a form of resistance they had never imagined possible. She had transformed the master's house into a hunting ground, and had used the very skills that made her valuable to destroy those who owned her. Some called it murder. Others called it war. Delphine called it mathematics, simple addition and subtraction, taking from those who had taken everything. On the second night of her confinement, Dr. Harlan Moss came to the tobacco barn. The guards admitted him without question. He carried his medical bag and claimed he needed to ensure the prisoner remained healthy enough for execution. Inside, he found Delphine sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on something beyond the barn walls. He set his bag on the floor and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I have attended many deathbeds," Dr. Moss said quietly. "I have seen men die with rage, with fear, with desperate bargaining for just one more day. You show none of these things. How is that possible?" Delphine turned her gaze to him, and Dr. Moss felt the weight of that stare like physical pressure. "Because I am already dead," she said simply. "I died the day they hanged Gabriel. Everything since then has been epilogue." "You killed 6 men, Dr. Moss said, though his voice carried no accusation, only a kind of weary curiosity. 7, if you count the overseer. You planned it, executed it with extraordinary precision, and documented your own crimes. Why did you keep the evidence? Why not destroy the ledger, the hair, the poison?" "Because I wanted them to know," Delphine replied. "Not at first I wanted only the satisfaction of watching them die, of balancing the scales in secret. But as time passed, I realized that dying in ignorance was too kind. They needed to understand that the very system that gave them power, that let them take and destroy and use human beings as tools, could be turned against them. They needed to know that the invisible woman who sewed their garments had the intelligence and will to transform beauty into death. They needed to know they were never really safe, never really in control. Dr. Moss nodded slowly. And the wedding suit you made for Augustus? You must have known you would be discovered before he could wear it. Why make it at all? Delphine's smile returned, cold and satisfied. Because even if he never wears it, he knows it exists. He knows he hung his death in his wardrobe and admired its construction. He knows he came within days of the same fate he condemned his brother's actions to inflict on me. That knowledge will haunt him for whatever years he has remaining. That is almost better than his actual death. Almost. Dr. Moss closed his bag slowly, his weathered face troubled. I do not know if what you did was justice or murder, Delphine. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the line between them is thinner than we care to admit. But I want you to know, I will remember you. I will remember what drove you to this, and I will speak of it to those who will listen. Your story will not end with the rope. Thank you, Dr. Moss, Delphine said, and for the first time, her voice carried a note of genuine warmth. That is all I could ask. The doctor left, and Delphine was alone again with her memories and her satisfaction. She slept that night without dreams, without nightmares, her conscience as clear as the morning light that would soon bring her execution. But when dawn came on the third day, when the guards arrived to escort her to the scaffold that had been erected beneath the same oak tree where Gabriel had died 8 years earlier, they found the tobacco barn door still locked, the guards still at their posts, and Delphine hanging from a roof beam by a rope she had woven from threads pulled from her own dress. She had cheated them of their spectacle, their warning, their public display of power reasserted. She had taken the final choice, the choice of when and how to die, and made it her own. Her body swayed slightly in the morning breeze that drifted through gaps in the barn walls, her face peaceful in death, her scarred fingers curved as though still holding an invisible needle. On the floor beneath her feet lay a piece of fabric she had been working on in secret, using thread she had unraveled from her clothing and a splinter of which sharpened to serve as a needle. The fabric bore a simple message stitched in letters that were uneven but legible. 9 suits. 9 souls. For Gabriel. For Lily. For Mama. For every lash, every scream, every stolen life. The pattern is complete. 9 suits. Sheriff Thorne counted quickly, Richard, James, Nathaniel, Thomas, Edmund, Clayton Hodge, and Augustus's unfinished wedding suit made 7. The guards searched the tobacco barn and found, hidden in the rafters, evidence of 2 more commissions Delphine had accepted but not yet completed, a baptism gown for the Ashford family's new grandson, the fabric already cut and partially assembled with her poison thread, and a set of dress shirts for a plantation owner from North Carolina who had heard of her reputation and sent his measurements by post. 9 deaths planned, 7 executed, 2 interrupted by her discovery. The mathematics, as Delphine had said, were finally complete. Augustus Pemberton stood in the tobacco barn doorway and stared at Delphine's body, at the message she had stitched, at the final defiance of her self-inflicted death. Something inside him, some last vestige of the certainty that had governed his life, the absolute confidence in the natural order that placed him above and Delphine below, crumbled like a structure built on sand. He had owned this woman since her birth. He had taken her labor, her family, her very existence and bent it to his purposes. And in the end, she had owned him more completely than he had ever owned her, had orchestrated his son's deaths and his own near death with a patience and intelligence that mocked every assumption he had made about the people he held in bondage. They cut Delphine down and buried her in the small cemetery behind the quarters, in an unmarked grave beside her mother and daughter. No prayers were said, Augustus forbade any Christian burial for a murderer, but that night, the enslaved workers of Willowmere gathered in the darkness and sang the old songs, the ones that spoke of crossing over, of chains breaking, of justice deferred but never forgotten. They sang for Delphine, for Gabriel, for Lily, for Iris, for all the names that would never appear in plantation records or county histories but lived on in memory and in a fierce determination to survive and resist and remember. The scandal of Delphine's crimes spread far beyond Tidewater, Virginia. Newspapers from Richmond to Charleston carried the story, each adding embellishments and moral lessons. Some portrayed her as a monster, proof that enslaved people required constant vigilance and harsh discipline. Others saw her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of teaching slaves skilled trades that gave them too much knowledge, too much access to the master's world. But among enslaved people across the South, whispered in the quarters and coded into spirituals and hidden in the folklore that passed from generation to generation, Delphine became something else, a reminder that resistance took many forms, that justice could be sewn into seams as easily as rebellion could be shouted from rooftops, that the powerless were never quite as powerless as their masters believed. Augustus Pemberton never remarried. He burned the charcoal wedding suit in his fireplace, watching the fabric blacken and curl, the poison consumed by flames that seemed inadequate to the task of purification. He closed the sewing quarters permanently, hiring a tailor from Petersburg for his family's clothing needs, never again allowing homemade garments to touch his skin. He died in 1862, just as the Civil War was tearing apart the system he had spent his life defending, his final years haunted by dreams of dove-gray suits and midnight blue wool, of silver embroidery that glittered like poison in candlelight, of a seamstress whose face never changed expression as she watched his sons die. The tobacco barn where Delphine died was torn down in 1863 by Union soldiers who briefly occupied Willowmere during their march through Virginia. The wood was used for firewood, the iron fittings melted down for other purposes. But the workers who had lived at Willowmere, who gained their freedom with the war's end, preserved Delphine's story. They told it to their children and grandchildren, told it to anyone who would listen, ensuring that her name would outlive the plantation that tried to erase it. In the years that followed, seamstresses across the South would sometimes find, hidden in the corner of an old sewing basket or tucked between the pages of a pattern book, a small jar of white powder with no label, no explanation, only a piece of fabric wrapped around it bearing a single word stitched in perfect, microscopic letters, remember. Whether these jars were relics of Delphine's work or symbols created by others inspired by her story, no one could say for certain. But they served as reminders that the needle could be both a tool of creation and an instrument of justice, that beauty and death were sometimes separated by nothing more than a seam, that those who appeared powerless might be patiently, invisibly, deadly waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Delphine's sewing basket, the one seized as evidence and stored in the courthouse, disappeared during the chaos of the war. Some said it was stolen by looters. Others claimed it was taken by a freed woman who understood its significance, who wanted to preserve this artifact of resistance and revenge. Wherever it went, whatever became of it, the basket vanished from history, taking with it the last physical traces of Delphine's work. But the story remained, passed down through generations, transformed by time and retelling into something between history and legend, between cautionary tale and inspiration. The pattern was complete, as Delphine had stitched in her final message. 9 suits for 9 souls, though only 7 found their marks before she was discovered. The mathematics were never quite balanced, no amount of death could restore Gabriel's life or Lily's laughter or Iris's broken heart, but Delphine had done what few enslaved people in 1850s Virginia could have imagined possible. She had made her masters afraid. She had proven that the system that bound her could not fully contain her, that intelligence and patience could triumph over brute power, that the invisible could become terribly, lethally visible. And somewhere, in an attic or a basement or a forgotten trunk, there might still exist one of Delphine's creations, a garment stitched with poison thread, folded carefully and waiting with the infinite patience of death itself. A wedding suit or christening gown or Sunday coat that looks perfectly innocent, it seems straight and strong, its fabric beautiful and deadly. Waiting for someone to try it on, to wear it against their skin, to discover too late that some stitches cannot be undone, some patterns cannot be broken, some debts must be paid in full. The enslaved seamstress who sewed arsenic into every master's wedding suit died in 1855, but her legacy, a legacy of resistance, of calculated vengeance, of transforming the tools of oppression into weapons of justice, lived on long after her unmarked grave was lost to time and weather. Her story became a whisper in the darkness, a reminder that those who seem silent might simply be choosing their moment, that those who serve might be watching and waiting and planning with a patience that the powerful can never understand until it is far, far too late. The pattern was complete. The final stitch was sewn. And in tobacco barns and sewing quarters across the South, needles continued to flash in the candlelight, working through fabric with steady, patient, possibly deadly precision. Thank you for watching this haunting tale. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more macabre horror stories from history, and let me know in the comments, was this justice or murder? I'll see you in the next dark chapter.